This was Europe's darkest hour. A relentless plague swept across the entire continent like a storm, turning vibrant towns into silent graveyards, turning people's laughter and hope into fear and wailing. This catastrophe was the Black Death of the 14th century. A plague that, in just a few short years, claimed 1/3 of Europe's population. Today, we will delve deep into the origins of the Black Death, its transmission methods, its horrifying symptoms, and its profound impact on society. Understand why this disaster is called the darkest chapter in human history. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, can trace its roots to the steppes of Central Asia. In the early 14th century, the wild animals in this land, especially rodents, such as black rats, carried a deadly bacterium, Yersinia pestis. Fleas carrying this bacterium were the primary vectors of the plague. The Mongol Empire was the most powerful state in the world at the time, its territory spanning across Eurasia. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, as the empire expanded, the Silk Road connecting east and west, as well as other important trade routes, became more prosperous. These trade routes started from Chang'an, China, passed through Samarkand in Central Asia, Bukhara and other prosperous cities, and extended west to the Mediterranean coasts, Constantinople, Alexandria, and other important ports. With the opening of these trade routes, Yersinia pestis, via bacteria-carrying fleas, spread along these trade routes, silently entering human society. In 1346, the city of Kaffa on the Black Sea coast became the Black Death's first gateway into Europe. The Mongol army was besieging the strategic location run by Italian merchants. When the plague broke out, soldiers fell one after another in order to inflict upon the city's inhabitants a dual psychological and physiological blow. The Mongols resorted to a horrifying tactic. They used catapults to hurl plague-infected corpses into the city. The decaying bodies released a sickening stench and pathogens, quickly contaminating the air and water sources. No inhabitant in the city was spared. They were infected one after another. This could be called the earliest biological warfare. The Italian merchants and sailors who fled Kaffa, carrying pathogens and goods, brought the plague back to the heart of Europe. European port cities like Genoa and Venice. With the arrival of these merchant ships, the plague began to spread rapidly across European lands. After the Black Death entered Italy in 1347, it spread at an astonishing speed. Italy's port cities became the first epicenters of the plague. Subsequently, the plague, through trade routes and human activity, spread to the entire European continent. France, Spain, Portugal, England, and then to Germany and the Scandinavian peninsula. None were spared. Even remote villages and outlying areas were affected within months or years. The plague's transmission was not limited to flea bites. The Black Death also had a more lethal form: pneumonic plague. This type of plague could be transmitted through airborne droplets, making person-to-person transmission extremely rapid. A cough or sneeze from an infected person was enough to spread the pathogens into the air, infecting an entire room of people. Because people at the time knew very little about bacteria and viruses, they did not realize the importance of droplet transmission. The plague thus spread unscrupulously between cities. After contracting the Black Death, the symptoms came extremely quickly and cruelly. Patients would initially feel a high fever, headache, and extreme weakness. Next, lymph nodes would swell, forming huge, dark purple buboes, especially in the armpits, groin, and neck. These buboes were called buboes. The infected person's skin began to turn black, tissues necrotized, and emitted a foul, putrid odor. And this is the origin of the name Black Death. People with bubonic plague would experience extreme pain, accompanied by high fever and continuous physical decline. Even more terrifying was the pneumonic plague. This form not only brought high fever and lung infection, but was also accompanied by violent coughing and spitting blood. The patient would die quickly in agony. Most infected people would meet their death within 3 to 5 days. Under the scourge of such a cruel disease, a peculiar figure began to appear in people's vision. They were the plague doctors. They wore long black robes, wore masks with long bird beaks, and carried a staff. The bird beak mask was filled with spices and herbs, such as rosemary, cloves, and mint. The doctors believed these could filter the miasma in the air, protecting them from plague infection. When treating patients, the plague doctors could only rely on extremely rudimentary tools. They had no modern stethoscopes. They could only press their ear close to the patient's chest to listen to breathing and heartbeat. But this method also put them at an extremely high risk of infection. When recording the patient's condition, they used rough parchment and simple quill pens to, in brief and crude text, record the patient's symptoms, such as the size of the buboes, color, the severity of the cough, etc. These valuable records became important materials for later generations to understand the Black Death. They were also responsible for handling corpses. With no protective equipment, they struggled to move the bodies, transporting them to mass graves outside the city. But their arrival was often seen as a bad omen, because in most cases, what they brought was not the hope of recovery, but rather an announcement of death. Although their attempts and treatment methods seem absurd and ineffective today, the efforts of the plague doctors left behind valuable historical records and also represented a fearless spirit when the Black Death swept across Europe. Panic and despair spread rapidly among the people. The streets were piled high with corpses, with not enough people to handle them. Bodies were hastily discarded in mass graves, or even thrown directly into rivers. Family members became estranged due to fear. Parents dared not hold their sick children. Spouses isolated themselves from each other. Neighbors became strangers. Churches and monasteries were filled with praying and weeping people. They appealed to God, hoping to find protection. But when the plague also claimed the lives of even devout clergy, people began to have deep doubts about the church and God. Extreme religious behaviors, such as the processions of flagellants, began to spread. They believed the plague was God's punishment for human sins, and atoned by self-mutilation and whipping themselves, hoping to appease God's wrath. These actions did not bring salvation. It only increased the chaos and panic in the cities. As the social order disintegrated and people's fear had nowhere to go, a more sinister emotion began to spread. That was the search for a scapegoat. And the Jewish people became the main target of accusations. They were accused of poisoning wells, being the main culprits of the plague. A wave of anti-Semitism swept across Europe. Thousands of Jews were tortured, expelled, and even massacred. Tens of thousands of Jewish people, in this fear and anger, paid the price. Reason and humanity were trampled in despair. Faced with this unprecedented plague, doctors tried various methods to control the epidemic: bloodletting, applying herbs, wearing amulets and herb pouches, etc., even fumigating the air with fire to purify the so-called miasma. These methods were all useless. The famous plague doctors traveled between cities, wearing long-beaked masks filled with spices and herbs, trying to protect themselves by purifying the air. But most doctors eventually also fell in the shadow of the plague. The Black Death ravaged Europe for nearly 7 years, only gradually subsiding in 1353. No one knows for sure why the plague stopped. Perhaps it was because the population decreased, reducing the sources of infection. Perhaps it was due to the natural decline of the pathogen. Whatever the reason, This plague left behind immeasurable consequences. Florence, Italy, lost nearly half its population. A city of originally about 100,000 people was left with only about 50,000 after the plague. England's population plummeted from about 4 million to about 2.5 million. Europe's population, in the plague, lost 1/3 to half. Social order completely collapsed within a few years. The labor force was short. This shortage problem seriously impacted society and the economy. Taking agriculture as an example, in France, the agricultural labor force reduction rate was about 60%. Large amounts of farmland lay fallow. Grain production fell from an original average of 200 kilograms per mu to less than 100 kilograms. This led to a rise in the status of peasants and workers. The feudal system was impacted. This spurred social and economic change. The Black Death also changed people's views on religion and science. The church was powerless to protect people during the plague. Religious authority faced an unprecedented challenge. People began to seek new knowledge and explore science. This laid the foundation for the subsequent Renaissance. Humanity, from this disaster, learned how to, in extreme fear, survive, and rebuild hope from the ruins. The Black Death is one of the darkest chapters in human history, but it is also a mirror, reflecting humanity's vulnerability and courage when facing the unknown and fear. Today, as we face global pandemics and challenges, history reminds us that science, unity, and calmness are the true weapons to overcome fear. In the darkest of times, humanity can always find the light to move forward.